Visit us at Eduvo. Thank you for calling Eduvo.
For the moment, and not for the entire app, but just for the moment, I'm done with the styling and the setup of the content. Of course, you can always tweak this to your requirements, and again, we will all change things later, but for the moment, I'm happy with these styles. I now want to focus on the next steps, which means that users should be able to add transactions here. And for that, we need some button that allows users to, well, start the process of adding a new transaction, open up some extra page or some extra input field where we can add a transaction. That would be pretty sweet. For that, let's go back to our code here. And first of all, I want to add an area where users can enter transaction data. Now we have our chart container, and below that we have the column with all our transactions. Now as a start, I want to make sure that this chart container and our transactions actually are ordered from top and bottom, which they are, but that they start at the beginning, that we don't have that space around setting. So let's go to the overall wrapping column here and change the main axis alignment to start, which is the default, hence we can comment this out. I'm using a shortcut here in my IDE. You can simply add 2 slashes in front of that if you want to. So now with that, we have all that content pushed up to the top. And now I want to add a new input area. For the moment, I'll add that input area below the chart. And that input area, in the end, will require a couple of different text inputs for the title, for the amount, and then also some input for the date. Now, since we need multiple widgets, what does this mean? We need a column or a row, because otherwise we can't have multiple widgets in the same part. Now, of course, we already are in a column. So here we could just add our text inputs. However, it would be nice to also have some styling around these text inputs. Maybe a border, maybe a background color. And therefore here we could add a card to get some default styling, light rounded corners, also some background color. And then in there, as a child, I want to have my text inputs. Now, as I said, this will be multiple text inputs, which should be all in that card. So since we will have multiple widgets in there, now we definitely need a column. You could use a row, but I think it makes more sense to have the text inputs sit on top of each other. Now, how do we create a text input though? There is a special widget in Flutter, the TextField widget. Don't confuse it with the text widget. The text widget, which we're using down there, is responsible for outputting text. The TextField widget is responsible for receiving user input. So we can add a TextField widget here. And if I add, let's say, for the moment, 2 TextField widgets here, and I save this, then indeed we see 2 lines here. So that's our card. The card is always a bit hard to see on the white background, but there is this card around it. We can maybe add some elevation here to increase the drop shadow. It's a bit easier to see. But most importantly, we see these 2 lines. That's the most important part here. So we have these 2 lines. And if I tap into a line here, indeed the soft keyboard should come up. If you're testing this on an iOS simulator, you might have to enable the soft keyboard in your toolbar at the top under the hardware item. So the soft keyboard comes up, and indeed we can enter text here. Thankfully, we can also enter it with our physical keyboard, which makes it easier to test this whilst we are developing. So that's pretty nice. We can enter this here. We can also close the soft keyboard here on Android. And therefore, we can enter text. However, at the moment, it's not clear which text should go into which text field. And of course, it would also be nice to have some spacing around the text fields so that they don't stretch the entire width of our card here. Also some spacing top and bottom, and in general, improve the layout, the styling, and also the information about our text fields. So to style this, as I said, it would be nice to have some spacing around our text fields. Now on a card itself, you can only define some margin, but no padding. So you can't define inner spacing between the card edges and the content of the card. The column also has no padding or margin argument, so we can't add spacing here. And you learned what you can do in this case. wrap it with a container. So here we can again use the refactoring tool to wrap the column here with a container. And with that wrapped here, you can add either a margin or a padding. Here it doesn't matter because we're now inside of the card. So margin around the container will add some spacing between the card and its content, and padding here will not add spacing between card and content because the content would be the container. But since we don't directly see the container, we would have some spacing between the card edge and then inside of the container between the container and our text fields. So both would work, and here I will go for padding and use edge insets all 10 to add a padding of 10 in all directions. So now we have some spacing and our text inputs don't stretch the entire width. We also have some spacing top and bottom. Now it would also be nice to have some labels on the text fields, and thankfully you can of course also pass arguments to text field to configure that. If you hit Control Space, you see there are a lot of things you can set. Feel free to go through these options on your own. Things like autocorrect and autofocus should be pretty clear. Autocorrect enables autocorrection when the user enters text. Autofocus makes sure that this gets focused the moment it is focusable. You have more strange arguments like controller and so on, which we'll use later. You can change the cursor color, so that marker in the text fields once the user tapped in there, which color it has, which radius, which width it has. You can change the decoration, which will become important for us in a second. You can enable or disable it, so whether the user can tap in there and that keyboard comes up or not, and so on. As always, play around with these settings, dive into the official docs, and get a feeling for what's happening there. At the moment, for us, the most interesting part here is the decoration argument, where we can add an InputDecoration object by instantiating the InputDecoration class, which is provided by Flutter. And there you can, for example, control whether there is a border around our text field. By default, we have this bottom border here. You can add a counter that indicates how many characters were entered. You can handle different error styles, and these are also things I will come back to later in this course once we dive deeper into handling user input, adding validation, and so on. For now, we'll not do that. So for the moment, what the most interesting thing here is the label text, because that is that extra piece of text above the text field which actually tells us what should be in the text field. Now, label text actually takes a string, not a text widget or any other widget, but just a string. And there we could enter title here to indicate that here, well, we want to have the title entered. Let me copy that and use the same setting for the second text field, but of course there I'm expecting the amount. With that saved, now we have these little titles above the text fields, which of course now help us a lot, because now we have a chance of understanding what should be entered here. Now we can enter content here, but we have no way of submitting it, of saving that as a new transaction. So as a next step, we should probably also, below the text fields, add a button. And here you could add a raised button or a flat button. I will go for a flat button here and give it a child, which should be a text widget here, where I want to say add transaction. You also need to add on pressed, and for the moment I'll set this to an empty anonymous function, just so that the button is enabled, but right now it won't do anything. And for the color, for the text color, I will use purple. With it configured, if you go back, you see that add transaction button here below our text fields. Now I'd like to have that button sit on the right, and that's just a personal preference. And to achieve that, you can of course go to your column here and add cross-axis alignment start. And that will move it to the left, actually. I mean end. That will move it to the right. Now that button is on the right. Now we have the button and we can press the button. Let's next make sure that we actually fetch the user input, save it somewhere, and when we click that button, we add a new transaction to our list of transactions, well, upon a button click.